Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Education USA Canada webinar. My name is Jenica Heim, and I'm the Education USA Advisor in Canada. Education USA is a free resource. We provide up-to-date, helpful, accurate information to you about studying in the United States. If you have any questions, I would really love for you to reach out to me. There's going to be a lot of contact information at the end of this presentation. My email address is ottawa@educationusa.info, and you can feel free to ask me anything about studying in the United States. Today, I'm very happy to, first of all, be celebrating International Education Week, so feel free to use the hashtag IEW2015 when Michael gives us some interesting information along the way. And as a very timely piece of information, Michael Lai is here from Minerva Schools at KGI, which is a very international type program, to tell us about the importance of global citizenship. So I'm going to let Michael go ahead and take it away. Thank you, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jenica. And it's been a real pleasure of ours at Minerva to work closely with Education USA. So I do student outreach in North America, but many of my colleagues around the world who do outreach for Minerva have worked very closely with their local Education USA providers and advisors. So today I wanted to start maybe just with the goal of the session. What I really wanted to do is give you guys a sense of the why behind global education and various global competencies. I know this term global citizenship is tossed around quite a bit, so I wanted to unpack what that actually means. I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of study abroad and international higher education experiences, potentially some ways to acquire these global citizenship skills, and thinking about looking at the data as to how these international higher ed experiences are going. And then finally, I wanted to think a little bit bigger, think aspirationally about what are the types of ideal global education experiences we want to see, not just the ones that are out there today, and what are the types of questions that we should be asking if you guys are working with students or yourselves are looking into global higher ed experiences. What are the frameworks and the ways of thinking about the ideal experience moving forward? So maybe to start, just to lay the landscape and the why. The reason we're having this conversation in the first place is that the world has become much more global in the last 30, 40, 50 years. This picture in the background on the slide is a visualization of global flight patterns. 2014, there were 3 billion annual airline passengers. But really, if you look at any measure of globalization and interconnectedness, whether that's trade, whether that's people moving across borders, whether that's jobs, the world's become more interconnected. And as a result, global citizenship skills are more important than ever. So what does global citizenship actually mean? This is a framework that I really like from Columbia Teachers College. And it really describes global citizenship as consisting of 4 different capacities. The first is a critical capacity, critical thinking skills, being able to interpret and analyze and synthesize information, evaluate information, and make decisions about it. A creative capacity when it comes to imagining and thinking aspirationally and questioning new potential ideas and solutions. A communicative capacity of observing, reflecting, being able to communicate your thoughts in written and verbal and various modalities. And finally, a global-minded capacity, a consciousness towards international issues and thinking real world about the issues out there. I think the important thing to emphasize about these capacities is, yes, they are what consist of global citizenship, but they're really important for any type of job or field, domestic or international. And however we want to construe domestic or international, whether that's the US, whether that's Canada, or your home country. These are skills that 93% of employers say are more important than the major that a student studies in college. And these are skills that cross disciplines. right? So no matter whether a student is a mathematician or a psychologist or a teacher or even something more global, a diplomat, these are skills that are important for all of them. So how do we cultivate these skills? How do we teach students these capacities in order to prepare them to be global citizens? Well, I think a really great opportunity is global higher education. So this is a set of images of different types of global higher ed experiences around the world. And global, higher education is really a time in students' lives when, by 18, their brains have cognitively developed to a certain amount. It's really a time when they're going to mature a lot, socially, intellectually, emotionally. It's the first time when, for many students, where they've been away from home for an extended period of time and are transitioning from being with their parents and being dependent to becoming independent. So I think this is a prime time in students' lives when we can cultivate these various global citizenship skills. And if we look at the numbers, in fact, 177 million college students study every year around the world. This is according to the OECD in 2012. So it's also a large number of students that we could potentially turn into global citizens. And if we look at the data out there, if we look at the research on the effectiveness of global higher education programs and global higher education experiences, the data is really good. So this is, there's a survey, there's this organization called IES Abroad. That is a study abroad organization, offers various programs, and has been around and did this very large longitudinal study starting from 1950 to 1999. All of the students who had gone through their program, 3,400 of them in total, they ran a survey about the global higher ed experiences they had, the study abroad experiences they had, and found that 98% actually demonstrated greater maturity, 95% demonstrated greater self-confidence, over 90% demonstrated more and more tolerance for diversity and for ambiguity. So immediately we kind of see that the research says global higher education clusters around this first big benefit, which is personal growth, right? And this directly maps to some of those global citizenship skills. In addition, global higher education, this is the same study from IES Abroad, where I believe it was about 93% of students finished their global higher ed experience and said that they reflected more closely on their own cultural values and biases, as well as better understood the values and biases of others and developed these intercultural skills, which this directly maps to that global-minded capacity of global citizenship. In addition to having, sort of permanently a more diverse friend group and an orientation towards making friends who are more diverse and different from them. So that's a second large benefit that the research says of global higher ed experiences. I think a final one is professional development and outcomes in the labor market. And this really is to put some data behind my point earlier that these global citizenship capacities are useful regardless of whether someone goes into a more international field, but really any job, any career or grad school or professional path that they choose to go down. So this is a survey from Erasmus, which is a global higher education and study abroad organization focused in continental Europe. And they found that 90% of students who went through their study abroad programs actually got into one of their top choice graduate schools. I believe it's like 95% found a job after 6 months, as opposed to only 50% of those who hadn't gone through the experience. I should mention this is a self-selective group of students who goes into the program, so the data looks especially good. But I think there is really preponderance of evidence out there that global higher ed experiences are a great way to teach these capacities and benefit students in these three ways: in terms of personal growth, in terms of the intercultural skills and development, as well as the professional development and outcomes. Okay, so just a quick recap so far. We know the world's become more global. We know that global citizenship skills are important for any job or any path that a student chooses to take. And the research out there says that in particular, study abroad and global higher ed experiences are a great way to prepare students to do global citizens. Well, let's actually look at the data of how is global higher ed doing? How are we, how many of those 177 million students are we actually reaching? And here, the story turns a little bit more sad. Oopsies. Great. So as we look at the data, unfortunately, very few college students in the world have a truly global experience, have that opportunity to develop these capacities through an immersive and intensive study abroad program, for example. So this is, according to the OECD, of 177 million college students worldwide around the world, only 4.5 million in 2012 studied outside of their home country during their undergraduate years. That's only 2% of the 177 million. In the US, the number is 1.4%. So it's really sort of a small number of college students all around the world that study outside their home country. And of that small number, of this really small orange pie slice that does, the most common countries visited are only sort of the usual suspects. So Europe is very, very popular. North America is second in terms of regions around the world. What's striking to me about this, and I'm biased because I live in San Francisco. I grew up in the United States. I'm of course biased. I love North America, and I like Europe as well. But what strikes me about this is as the world changes, how small the slivers for Africa and Asia are. Given that this century, by the end of 2100, 50% of the world's population growth will have come from the African continent. Given that if you look at the most populous cities in 2050, a projection of that, a lot of those cities come from Southeast Asia. This is kind of what concerns me about this, is that right now we're still sort of have most students going to Western Europe, going to the Western civilizations, when in fact there's so many other places around the world for them to prepare and to cultivate the intercultural skills necessary to be successful in the coming decades. So the current state of global higher ed is not particularly strong when it comes to access and sort of having these experiences. Another piece that is a little bit concerning is also the experience on campuses. So here is a list of the top 10 global universities. This is according to the academic ranking of world universities, which is one of the big 2 or 3 global university rankings. So we have some of the Ivy League, we have Berkeley, Oxbridge on here as well. And what strikes me about this is, if you look at the graph of, this is the where the student bodies of these top universities, where do they come from? And if you look at the graph, the gray bar, overwhelmingly 85, 90, sometimes more % of these student bodies come from their home countries. So in the case of Harvard, it would be 90% of students come from the United States, and 10% of students come from outside the United States. From Oxford, it would be 83% of students from outside this is actually the European Union, so 83% of students outside the EU, and 17% of students from inside the EU. So the big takeaway here for me is that on even in some of the best universities in the world, some of the richest, the ones that can really afford to provide more access to international students are still an isolated minority, which I think is a detriment both for the international students, where they can have an experience that perhaps is not as mainstream to that university, but also for the domestic students as well. Personally, I was an alumnus of Harvard. I graduated a couple of years ago, and the fact that most of my students, my fellow classmates, were from the United States was sort of, for me, I think, like, I missed out a little bit on the enriching experience of interacting with students from all around the world as well in my student body. And I think one of the big reasons for this piece in particular, the composition of student bodies, has to do with access in terms of admissions and in terms of financial aid. So there are actually only 7 universities in the United States, at least, that are need blind in admissions to international students, meaning they don't factor in international students' financial situation when assessing the admissions decision, and are also meet full financial need. So meaning that whatever the financial situation or background of the international student, they will meet that full, the entire way with need-based or merit-based financial aid. So there's definitely this sort of access issue as well, and the cost of an international study abroad experience. So I have a question. How many universities are need blind? Can you repeat the number? I'm actually not sure of US universities how many are need blind. There are 7 that are both need blind as well as meet full financial need, so the 1 and the 2, for international students. Yeah. So in terms of the number that are need blind to international students, I imagine the number is larger, but it's still, this is just speaking for just US universities. But yeah. Okay, so we've kind of looked at the current state of global higher education experiences. It's a little bit lacking if we want to prepare students to be these global citizens, both what's going to be sort of most enriching for them personally, as well as professionally in their lives. So let's kind of think big picture. Let's say, like, what does the ideal global experience look like? We know what it's like today. What could it look like in the future? And to that, I want to turn to this quote from a New York Times article in 2013 that says, study abroad has to be done correctly. It shouldn't be a separate or tangential part of education, but rather an integrated part of the curriculum, incorporating proper cross-cultural preparation and supportive reintegration to help students understand and internalize what they learn. So what I really take away from this quote is that in the future, it's not just going to be about students traveling more or having purely cultural experiences, although that's an important piece of study abroad, but it's really this intersection between the academic curriculum and pedagogy and teaching these competencies together with the cultural immersion that's really powerful. And so I think we're seeing this actually with the rise of many, many new programs in the last few years. Speaking for some colleges in the States, I think partnerships between top US universities like New York University or Yale University in new branches like NYU's Abu Dhabi campus or Shanghai campus, or Yale's NUS partnership in Singapore. And this is the same spirit that Minerva was created as well in 2012 to be sort of a US university that's very global in scope. I think we're starting to see movement in this direction. So let's actually break it down. Like, what are the specific components of what an ideal global education experience could look like? And I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts, in discussion and questions, etc. So please feel free to type in any thoughts you might have. To break it down into a couple of different pieces, I think the first piece is the immersion piece, and specifically, the important piece is making sure that students are not tourists, but actually residents of the cities and the places that they go to, right? So that's sort of the first piece, is because the problems of the world are becoming more global and the world's becoming more interconnected, it's important that students really on the ground get to interact with these problems. And what climate change policy looks like in San Francisco is going to be markedly different than what it looks like in Bangalore or in London, for example. And then also interact with the local people, right, and build those intercultural skills, that global capacity part of the global citizenship framework. So I think that's the first thing, is really making sure it's cultural immersion and not just tourism. I think that's a first component of an ideal experience. But as I mentioned, and as the New York Times quote put so eloquently, it's not just about the travel experience and the culture, it's also going to be about the academics married with that. So another piece is, curricula and academics that explicitly teaches global citizenship skills, right? So explicitly teaches critical thinking and creative thinking, communications and interactions. And in this context, interactions means collaboration and leadership and negotiation, some of these different aspects. I think what's really powerful about this intersection of the immersion and the academics is that students then get these skills and they see real-world applications of them wherever they go for their global higher education experience or for their study abroad, right? So let's say they're taking a service learning trip and they're taking a course on, let's say design thinking, and they're going to, let's say Senegal, then that's really going to teach them how to think creatively, because they're not only are they taking a course on design thinking and divergent thinking, but they're also prototyping real world solutions and service learning on the ground when they're in that place. Right? So I think that merger is really, really powerful. And then there's this final piece, which I sort of talked about when I spoke to the limitations of diversity on campuses at some of our top universities, even, is also making these experiences accessible to students all over the world. How do we improve access and admissions for international students as well as for students from that home country domestically, because that leads to a more enriching and multicultural community for both types of students. How do we make sure that we cut costs in terms of certainly just like cut costs, but also fundraise for financial aid that's need-based and given out equally to domestic and international students. And I think if we can accomplish those things, then we can find student bodies that are also much more international. So a challenge for you guys, and these three areas in particular, the global cultural immersion, the curriculum that teaches global citizenship skills, and finally the access and global student body. These are definitely precepts of how Minerva was founded. We're a new university started in 2012 by a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and a Harvard dean, and these are sort of some of the areas that we've thought about. Right now we're still pretty small, so this year is our second class of students with 111 freshmen. Next year we're looking to grow. And not all students will be able to attend selective global universities like Minerva or like Yale in US or NYU Abu Dhabi or some of these types of experiences. So the broader challenge that I want you to take away is, how can you seek out experiences that will cultivate the skills needed to be a successful global citizen? How do you ask these types of aspirational questions, look at the data on outcomes, when it comes to looking at all programs, whether you are a student yourself or whether you are guiding your students in whatever trajectory they pursue. So that's the challenge that I want to leave you all with. And finally, here's a little bit more information. This is like a couple of the frameworks that I had and data resources that I had brought up today in the presentation. And then this is my email. This is more about Minerva in case you're curious about sort of our approach to global education. It's a 4-year accredited college where students live and learn in 7 world cities. So they travel to dorms around the world. But here's my email. Here's a little bit more about Minerva. But any questions from anyone about anything that we had mentioned today in the webinar, please feel free to type into chat.
Thank you so much, Michael, for all of that great information. And it definitely got me wanting to travel a bit more, that's for sure. So if anybody has more questions, feel free to type them in, and I'll just go ahead and give a couple of final remarks. We can always go back to any final questions here. Definitely. So just a couple of reminders that today, November 18th, 2015, there is a large international education fair taking place. So please, you can join by clicking right there on the hyperlink. And also our next webinar is a writing workshop. For the majority of applications, you will need to write a personal statement. Michael, I think for your university, is it a video personal statement as well, or is it just a written statement?
It's actually neither. So we have a video interview for Minerva admissions. It's like a free application. We don't do SAT, ACT. We don't do personal statements or council recs. Because some of the countries that we have students applying from don't necessarily have counselors or don't have access to test prep or things like that. So yeah, it's kind of our own application.
Yeah, so Michael is their university is very unique in that way with a very cool kind of admissions process. But for the majority of universities, especially if it's a Common App university, you will be writing a personal statement.
Totally.
And that's true for graduate level as well. So our next webinar is going to cover how to best write these statements. So please feel free to register using the below link for December 9th, 2015. And lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, connect with Education USA Canada. If you have more questions about what Michael discussed or any other admissions related questions, we can set up a one-on-one advising session. You should subscribe to our awesome monthly newsletter and follow us all over social media. I post really cool pictures like the one that you see there with our awesome sunglasses, and really great daily tips. So please join me one more time in thanking Michael for taking his time today to give us this excellent information. And as previously mentioned, you can email him or me with any follow-up. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everyone.